No warm-up, no comforting preface. I want to go straight to the point, because the point matters too much to soften. When I look at politics, I look at it the way I look at markets, I look at incentives, I look at structures, I look at what the system is designed to do, then I look at what it is actually doing. And when those two things split apart, I know something important is happening. That is where we are now. What has happened in British politics over the last several months is not a routine wobble. It is not a passing controversy. It is not one more ugly week in a news cycle built to exhaust you. It is a structural break. A 200-year structure is being cracked open in plain sight. And most people still do not understand what that means because they are staring at individual personalities, individual scandals, individual parties, individual speeches, individual headlines, individual by-elections. I am not interested in individual noise until I know what system the noise is coming from. That is why I want to begin with one small by-election in a suburb of Manchester. Not because one local vote decides the future of Britain, because little fractures often reveal the stress inside the whole foundation. That is true in finance, that is true in politics. And if you know how to read those fractures, they tell you where the system is heading before the wider public is ready to admit it. But before I get to that by-election, I need to take you back to where the structure still looked familiar. 6 months ago, when this analysis began, the next British general election still looked like something Britain had always known how to produce, a two-horse race. One horse called Labour, one horse called Reform. That picture made sense inside the old logic. Britain uses first past. The post-America uses first past. The post-former British political systems often inherited some version of it, and first past. The post does not naturally produce elegant pluralism. It produces compression, it punishes fragmentation, it rewards concentration, it nudges politics toward a two-party shape, even when the country underneath it contains far more than two real tribes. That is why Britain was, for so long, functionally a two-party story. That is why America is still trapped inside its own two-party shell. The machinery was built to deliver that outcome. And when the machinery is built to deliver an outcome, you should never casually assume it can stop delivering it without tremendous force being applied somewhere inside the engine. That is why I take what has happened so seriously, because when a structure designed to produce two main winners suddenly begins behaving like it can no longer decide which of 5 or 6 contenders even belongs in the race, you are no longer looking at ordinary democratic churn, you are looking at system failure. Now let me slow this down and walk you through how impossible this would have sounded not long ago. Back in September of last year, the betting market, which I respect not because it is always right, but because it is often more honest than political commentary, was assigning the next British general election to two obvious parties. Reform had roughly a 50% chance of finishing. First Labour had roughly a 1 in 3 chance. The rest was scraps. A little for the Conservatives, a little for the Liberal Democrats, nothing remotely revolutionary. That was still the old shape of politics, a two-horse race. And if you know anything about markets, you know the first question to ask is not, what do I wish would happen? It is, what does the market believe, and what do I know that the market may still be underestimating? That is the trader S instinct. And the trader S instinct here was simple. If living standards keep falling, incumbents keep getting punished. That is not a British story. It is not even really a Western story. It is a system story. When the average person feels poorer, weaker, less secure, less hopeful than he expected to feel after years of work, he starts blaming whoever sits closest to power. And if the people in power do not reverse that deterioration, their legitimacy bleeds away faster than elite institutions expect. That is what I have believed for a long time. Rising wealth inequality eats the social center. Falling living standards erode trust in incumbents. And neither politicians nor traders have understood the speed of that process well enough. That view helped me in markets. It also helps in politics. So 6 months ago, the clean prediction was straightforward. Labour, as the governing force, would become less popular as living standards continued to disappoint. Its probability of winning would fall. And because Britain still appeared to be operating inside a two-horse system that should have meant the other horse reform would rise, that is what should happen in a normal two-horse race. One horse stumbles, the other gains ground, simple, elegant, predictable. And this is exactly where the old order began to die. Because the first half of the prediction worked. Labour did decline. Its probability of winning fell materially. That made sense. The public was unhappy. The economy was not delivering relief. The governing party looked weak on living standards, weak on economic imagination, weak on the basic question that dominates modern politics in one country after another. Why is ordinary life getting worse, and why is nobody in charge fixing it? That question destroys governments. So Labour's decline was not surprising. What was surprising, almost impossibly surprising inside a first pass, the post system, was that reform also fell sharply at the same time. That should not happen in a healthy two-party structure. If Labour falls, reform should absorb the anger. That is the theory. Instead, both dropped. That is the signal, that is the fracture line. That is the moment when I stopped thinking in terms of routine electoral movement and started thinking in terms of structural collapse. Because once both horses in a two-horse race start moving backward at the same time, the race is no longer the thing you thought it was. And when I say this is historic, I mean that quite literally. The British system has spent centuries producing a first or second logic for its major parties. First the Conservatives and the Liberals, then the Conservatives and Labour, again and again, decade after decade, generation after generation. The names changed, the duopoly structure remained. That is what broke. Now, why did reform fall even as Labour fell? Part of the answer lies outside Britain. Donald Trump has become, for many observers, a warning label attached to the modern far right. Not because every right-wing party is identical, but because when people watch a government present itself as disruptive, anti-elite, anti-system, and then still preside over pressure on living standards, they begin realizing something deeply destabilizing. The new insurgents are not necessarily solving the old problem. They may simply be performing a more theatrical version of it. That realization hurts parties adjacent to that image. It hurts movements that rely on public faith that a more radical rightward turn will deliver ordinary prosperity. If the flagship looks chaotic, reckless, and economically harmful, the entire family of similar parties absorbs some of that damage. That is part of what happened. But the larger reason was even more brutal and much more local. Reform split. And in first past the post-system, splits are poison. They are not mild inconveniences. They are structural self-harm. A splinter emerged to the right through Rupert Lowe and Restore Britain. And whether most of the country had heard of the new formation or not, the betting market took it seriously enough to assign it meaningful probability. That is all it takes. In proportional systems, fragments can survive in first past. The post-systems, fragments often kill each other, so now the impossible has happened. Labor is falling because it governs amid declining living standards. Reform is falling because it has split, because the wider right is contaminated by the global image problem of Trumpism, and because first past the post punishes division. And once both horses start losing together, the whole shape of the race changes. That is where the by-election in Gorton and Denton becomes so revealing, because what happened there was not merely a local embarrassment. It was a miniature model of the future. Labor was already badly unpopular. Keir Starmer was badly unpopular. The government looked tired, weak, and distrusted. Reform had national momentum on paper, but all the underlying fractures were there. And inside that environment, a vacant seat appeared in Manchester. Now, under normal conditions, this should not have mattered much. One seat, one by-election, a local contest, plenty of room for protest voting and symbolic noise, but the timing made it explosive because Labour needed a path back to credibility. And there was one obvious figure who could have provided some version of it. Andy Burnham, popular in Manchester, more electorally viable than the Prime Minister. Arguably the most plausible Labour figure if the party were serious about surviving the next general election, and yet the system around Starmer blocked that route. That matters more than people think, because when a party facing electoral collapse blocks its own strongest path to renewal in order to protect a weak incumbent, it is telling you something essential about its relationship to power. It is no longer organized around winning. It is organized around internal control. That is an extremely dangerous stage for any institution. I have seen companies do it. I have seen boards do it. I have seen political parties do it. They stop asking, what gives us the best chance to survive? They start asking, how do we preserve the current hierarchy a little longer, even if doing so worsens the eventual collapse? That is exactly what Labour looked like in that moment. And once Burnham was blocked, the market quite sensibly read the by-election differently. The Greens became the natural beneficiaries that was rational. Labour had no compelling rescue narrative. Reform was not clean enough to absorb everything. And the Greens, under Zach Polanski's line of attack, had already started occupying a space Labour refused to enter. That space matters because here we get to the deepest thesis under all of this. The center is collapsing because it refuses to answer the economic pain in language that feels real to ordinary people. That is the core. Not immigration alone, not culture alone, not personality alone, economics, living standards, wealth inequality, the simple fact that people increasingly believe, often correctly, that the system is working for asset holders at the top, while their own families are being priced out of security, priced out of housing, priced out of hope, and priced out of the future they were promised. If politics refuses to speak to that incredible language, people go elsewhere. That is what happened all over Europe. That is what is happening in Britain. Now, that is what would happen in America too, if the two-party shell were less airtight. Spain fractured, France fractured, Italy fractured, Germany fractured, the Netherlands fractured, the center, left, and center. Right parties that once dominated these systems lost the authority that comes from delivering broadly shared prosperity. Once that authority goes, the labels remain longer than the trust does. That is what Britain is finally catching up to. The country is late, not exempt. Its structures were simply stronger at suppressing the visible fracture. Now, the fracture is visible, and the Manchester by-election showed exactly how visible it has become. The Greens won, Labour came third. That alone is humiliating enough. But what turned humiliation into revelation was Labour's response. They had the chance to absorb the loss honestly, acknowledge the anger, acknowledge the weakness, acknowledge that blocking Burnham had made defeat likely. Instead, they did something strategically catastrophic. They lied about the race. They pushed a Guardian line saying they had the data, that the contest was really between Labour and Reform, that this was a classic two-horse confrontation between decent centrism and grievance politics. That was their chosen frame. And it was immediately disproven by the result. This matters more than a lot of people realize, because at the next general election, Labour's one plausible surviving message may well be exactly that frame. You may not love us, you may not trust us, but the election is between us and the far right that can work. It has worked elsewhere. The French center used variants of it. Biden used variants of it. Boring centrism can still win when the choice is successfully simplified into boring versus frightening. That is one of the few remaining assets the center still has. And Labour used that asset in a one-seat by-election where it was not only unnecessary, but immediately disprovable. That is astonishingly bad strategy. It is the political equivalent of using your last credible balance sheet defense to cover a tiny quarterly embarrassment and then discovering you have nothing believable left when the full funding crisis arrives. That is not tactical error. That is self-sabotage. And the betting market saw it. This is the part that matters to me most, because markets cut through excuses faster than party loyalists do. The moment the by-election exposed Labour's position so brutally, Labour's odds weakened further. Reform's weakness was already visible. The Greens had proof of breakthrough. Restore Britain existed as a fragment on the right. And suddenly the next general election no longer looked like a two-horse contest with two weak contenders. It looked like an open field in a system that was never supposed to produce an open field. That is history breaking in real time. And when I say this is the end of a 200-year trend, I am not being poetic. I mean the long-running assumption that Britain, like other first past the post systems, will always collapse back into a stable two. Party center cannot be treated as safe anymore. The probabilities are now scattered. Labour still has a chance. Reform still has a chance. The Conservatives are not dead enough to vanish entirely. The Greens now occupy meaningful probability space. Restore Britain, absurdly for a party so new, occupies probability space. Scotland and Wales complicate the map further. This is not noise. It is shattering. And Britain is not unique. The British case is simply a late-stage version of a wider Western pattern. The old center cannot hold if it refuses to address living standards. Honestly, that is the whole story. You can call it anti-incumbency, you can call it fragmentation, you can call it populism, you can call it disillusionment. All of those labels describe pieces of the phenomenon, but underneath them all is one financial and political fact. When inequality rises and living standards fall, centrist parties that defend the status quo eventually lose the legitimacy they need to keep the system stable. That is the mechanism. Once enough people stop believing the center can improve their lives, they stop treating the center as inevitable. That is when politics becomes volatile. That is when vote shares splinter. That is when new parties rise overnight. That is when local contests become national signals. That is when betting markets stop pretending certainty exists. That is where we are. Now let me say something even more important. This does not automatically mean the far right wins and stays dominant. In fact, one of the document's most important arguments is that the far right may not be able to hold power either, because if it comes to office and also presides over falling living standards, it will burn through legitimacy in exactly the same way. That is the real vacuum. Not simply that the center is dying, that both the old center and the insurgent right are still failing to solve the underlying material problem. That means the space remains open, and open space in politics is rare, very rare. It is why this moment matters so much. There is a demand waiting to be organized, a demand for a politics that can explain in plain language why ordinary people are getting poorer and what will actually be done about it. Not symbolic warfare, not managerial apology, not empty stability, a real economic answer. That is the opening. That is why the document keeps returning to wealth inequality as the master explanation. You can argue with the exact policy path, fine, but the strategic point is unmistakable. There is now an electoral reward available for anyone who can credibly connect falling living standards to the concentration of wealth and then offer a political answer that sounds both serious and legible to the public. That is why Zach Polanski matters in this analysis. Not because one leader solves everything, because he recognized the lane before Labor did. He recognized that social media is where political power is shifting. He recognized that wealth taxes and inequality speak directly to the pain people already feel. He recognized that old media gatekeepers matter less when trust in the old parties is collapsing. That is strategic intelligence. And when the Greens won in Manchester, it was not simply a by-election victory. It was proof of concept, proof that once a center left party abandons economic credibility, someone else can walk into the gap and start taking vote share with a message built around inequality and living standards. That is the part Labor should fear most. Not just losing one seat, losing the economic language of opposition itself, because once another party owns that language, the center becomes doubly trapped. It cannot defend the status quo effectively because the status quo is failing, and it cannot easily pivot into a serious anti-inequality platform because it has spent too long refusing to speak that way when it had the chance. That is how historic parties disappear. Not all at once. They become strategically stupid at the exact moment the world changes underneath them. Then someone smaller, faster, and hungrier takes the message they should have claimed years earlier. Now, what happens next? That is the title question, and I want to answer it carefully. The first thing that happens next is continued fragmentation. I do not believe Britain smoothly returns to a stable two-party frame on command. Not after this. Not while living standards remain weak. Not while Labor remains as compromised. Not while reform is split and contaminated by the broader global image problem of Trumpism. Not while the Greens have proof that there is a lane open to them. The second thing that happens is strategic panic inside the old parties. They will try message discipline, they will try fear framing, they will try anti-far, right simplification, they will try buying time. Some of those moves may work temporarily, but they will not solve the underlying deterioration. And without solving the underlying deterioration, the legitimacy leak continues. The third thing that happens is that more local shocks will matter nationally, under ordinary conditions, by elections, council races, regional swings, and activist surges are interesting, but limited in a period of structural fracture, they become magnified. Each one acts as a test case for the wider realignment. Each one gives the public another glimpse of the fact that the old order is not merely unpopular, it is breakable. That psychological shift is enormous. Once voters realize the old structure can actually crack, they begin behaving differently inside it. That accelerates everything. The fourth thing that happens is international convergence. Britain is not moving towards some uniquely British future. It is joining a pattern already visible elsewhere. More parties, less loyalty, more volatility, more economic anger, less deference to the old center, greater role for digital politics, greater role for outsider narratives, greater demand for blunt economic explanations. This will keep spreading. Not because every country is identical, because the underlying material pressures are similar enough. And the fifth thing that happens, the most important thing, is that the vacuum becomes contestable. That is the real opportunity. If the center recognizes the threat and changes radically, it may survive in altered form. If it does not, it will continue to shrink and eventually disappear as a serious vessel of legitimacy. If the far right rises but then governs in ways that worsen ordinary life, it too will burn through support faster than its own believers imagine. That means there is room to build. Real room, not theoretical room, political room, media room, social room, economic room. And that is where the document becomes openly strategic. It stops merely describing the collapse and starts arguing for intervention. Vote, organize, educate, push the message again and again. Wealth inequality is making people poorer. Living standards are falling because the system is concentrating gains while distributing pain. If that message becomes common sense, then parties will eventually be forced to respond to it or die. That is the wager. Now, whether you agree with every tactical element of that wager is secondary. The central observation is correct. A system built on two parties is now behaving like a shattered field, because neither the center nor the insurgent right has solved the material problem driving public rage. That means politics has become radically more open than it has been in generations. And openness is both dangerous and profitable. Dangerous because broken systems can produce ugly outcomes. Profitable because the people who see the break early are always better positioned than the ones who keep pretending the old map still works. That is true in markets, that is true in politics, that is true here. So what happens next? The center either adapts or dies. The far right either improves living standards or burns through its momentum. The fragmented middle keeps splintering until somebody offers a convincing economic answer that enough people recognize as their own. And until that happens, the old certainty is gone. gone. That is what the Manchester by-election showed. That is what the betting market shows. That is what Europe already showed, and that is what Britain is finally beginning to understand. A 200-year trend did not simply wobble, it broke. The only question now is who is prepared to build in the space that opened up when it did.